Hello, today I'm going to read you Mr. Happy from the Mr. Men. On the other side of the world, where the sun shines hotter than here, and where the trees are 100 feet tall, there is a country called Happy Land. As you might as well expect, everybody who lives in Happy Land is as happy as a day is long. Whether you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place. Even the flowers seem to smile on Happy Land. And as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happy Land are happy as well. If you've never seen a happy mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, go to Happy Land. This is a story about someone who lives in Happy Land and who happens to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. He lived in a small cottage outside, beside a lake, at the foot of a mountain and close to a wood in Happy Land. One day, while Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in those woods near his home, he came across something that was really rather extraordinary. There was a trunk of one of the very tall trees was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless a door. Certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. I wonder who lives in there, thought Mr. Happy to himself, and he turned the handle of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open easily. Just inside the small, narrow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downwards. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and around and down and down and round and down and down and round. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw, there in front of him, another small, narrow door. But this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked on the door. "Who's there?" said a voice, a sad, squeaky sort of voice. "Who's there?" Mr. Happy pushed open the red door very slowly, and there, sitting on a stool, was somebody who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except that he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. "Hello," said Mr. Happy. "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, you are indeed," sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. "Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world." "Why are you so miserable?" said Mr. Happy. "Because I am," replied Mr. Miserable. "How would you like to be happy like me?" asked Mr. Happy. "I'd give anything to be happy," said Mr. Miserable. "But I'm so miserable, I don't think I'd ever be happy," he added miserably. Mr. Happy made his mind up quickly. "Follow me," he said. "Where to?" said Mr. Miserable. "Don't argue," said Mr. Happy, and they went up, and they went out through the small, narrow, red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated, and then followed. Up and up the windy staircase they went. Up, round and round, and up and round and round and up, until they came into the woods. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy again, and then they both set off through the woods back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time. And during that time, the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happyland, Mr. Miserable even so slowly stopped being miserable and started to be happy. His mouth stopped turning down in the corners. And even so very slowly started turning up in the corners. And eventually, Mr. Miserable did something that he'd never done in his whole life. He smiled, and then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which turned into a laugh. A big, blooming, heartily, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well. And the both of them laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. They went outside and still they laughed. And because they laughed so much, everybody that saw them started to laugh. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh, although they thought somebody called Mr. Mischief who had just couldn't stop laughing. And that's really the end of the story, except to say that if you ever feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable, well, that he used to, know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth at the corners and go.